Good evening, everyone. I'm Sandy Waters, president of the League of Women Voters of Greenwich. We're letting people in as I speak, and we appreciate your willingness to attend this members-only event. Jess Reed from Greenwich Point Marketing is helping us manage the Zoom format, which is a little complicated given the number of people attending and the number of people on the committee who need to participate. So hang with us as we kind of work through this. The League believes that the maintenance and renewal of the town's capital infrastructure and the process to inform its funding deserves more transparency and community conversation. This capital project study was proposed and approved at the 2019 League's program planning meeting. The scope of the study was then drafted by President Cindy Anderson and former League President Yara Burnett. It was presented to and approved by the membership at the 2019 annual meeting. The committee was formed and interview questions and study subjects were identified, but COVID complicated continuation, and the study's extension was unanimously approved by the membership in 2021, and a new committee was formed. The board agreed that Steve Waters would be the chairman with Barbara O'Neill as co-chair. They recruited participants from diverse backgrounds to serve, and the committee has been working for the past 18 months. Twice this year, Steve has reported on the committee's progress to the board, and after the November election, we shared the full study with background information with the membership, inviting them to attend this meeting. This is the agenda for tonight's meeting. Jess, can you put that up? There we go. I just want to say first, I'm at the call to order phase, and there will be then a presentation conducted by the members of the committee led by Steve. Then there will be a Q&A. And then we'll have a closing and adjournment at the end. You will, as a participant, be able to participate in submitting questions during the presentation through the chat function, which is in the bottom of your screen. During the actual Q&A, there will be an opportunity for you to raise your hand by going to the reactions button at the bottom of the screen and raising your hand so that I know who is there and wants to speak. We're here tonight to hear the results of the study process and the committee's recommendation. This is an opportunity for you to understand and to discuss their conclusions. Steve will lead the presentation, bringing in committee members to articulate specific issues. And again, there are two opportunities to submit comments or questions. During the chat function during the presentation, and I will then bring those questions in during the Q&A. And then you may also raise your hand by asking a verbal question during the Q&A portion of the agenda. I'll have to ask you to unmute yourself so that you can then ask your question directly. So thank you again for coming. And at this stage, I want to turn over the meeting to Steve Waters.
Thank you. Jess, let's start with the presentation and we'll go from there because I'll talk with that as a background if that's okay. Okay, let's move on to the second page. What we're going to talk about is a little bit more about the committee, affirmation of what we've done, a sense of the current situation in Greenwich, recommendations, how big are the town's capital needs, a variety of potential process improvements, and then things that the committee, Capital Project Study Committee, thought the League itself could consider. If you turn to the next page, please, Jess, I want to talk about the committee a little bit. These folks did a lot of work. They were selected by, in a sense, being nice and willing to do it. And you can see Mike has been heavily involved, as has Steph, particularly on the needs and the processes side. Hillary was who has architectural knowledge, was very helpful. Becky was her normal assiduous self on a variety of topics, in particular on the financing side, as was Kate on the process and need side. Steve Munger led the financing section of this, looking at funding options. Barbara was a really able co-chair who, with Becky, did the long version that if you looked at the long version report and have notices about punctuation or other issues, Barbara and Becky are the ones to call because they were willing to go through the whole thing multiple times. Joe Ross, who has a construction background, was helpful on this, as was Larry Simon, who you all know, and John Weiner, helpful again on the finance side. So I need to thank all of them for the time and effort that they put in. We asked people on the basis of what we thought would be expertise, but we also used as criteria a willingness to do the actual work as opposed to be on a committee. We ideally sought people who could collaborate with each other and didn't have their minds made up before we started to do the work. And we intentionally wanted to have diverse political affiliations. And so what we wanted to try to do was to have a consensus of this very diverse group on what we were recommending, because the focus is what can the town do better or differently once we understand what it's doing. It's not to point fingers at who's right or who's wrong. It's not to side with the BET or the Board of Ed or the Selectman's office. But we think that there's always an opportunity to improve. And so what we tried to do was to identify the things that the town can consider. At the end of this, there is a draft of a statement, and I say draft because a final consensus or concurrent statement will need to be agreed by the committee and the league board, but that will be available for you by the time we have a final presentation. And if you go to the next page, Jess, this is what we did. We talked about where we were starting in June of 21, focusing on how the town picks and funds capital projects, process improvements, what the scope should include in terms of planning, priority setting, relationship to the plan of community development, transparency, funding sources, and oversight. And then we as a committee organized around process and needs and funding, because those in a sense turned out to be in somewhat separate work streams, although we kept having to bring them back together. We developed a list of key questions. We developed a list of people we could talk to. And then we had 1 to 2 hour interviews with a wide variety of people. And people like Becky were very good at submitting minutes. So and we taped them inside the committee so people could look if they didn't have a chance to make a specific section. We then spent a lot of time on what could be the key observations and recommendations, particularly and where we could get consensus. So I think with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mike Bodson and let Mike start to talk about town capital needs, because this is where we started. And Mike, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. So if we could turn to the next page, please. Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you for letting me present on this. As Steve said, this was an extensive review. I do want to thank, if you look at the long report, the list of people we interviewed and who were very cooperative and very open with their time and generous with their comments. I do want to thank ahead of time. You know, this was not a singular, as Steve said, singular view, but this was views that were built up over a series of dialogues. And just to set the baseline, if you look over the town's 2022-23 budget, you can see what the future needs are. And it goes out about 15 years, and it approximates $1.25 billion in the 15-year capital plan. And this is above and beyond the operating budgets, which are at this point somewhere north of $450 million. So obviously there's a significant buildup. At the same time, the complexity is that it represents the needs and wishes of a variety of different departments in town. So you'll have everything from Parks and Recs doing what they have to do to maintain the quality of the parks and the recreational facilities, which are key to the town, to the large capital needs of the Board of Ed, where they're managing multiple buildings, all in different stages of maturing, some older, some younger. And obviously they represent very significant needs whenever they have to be rebuilt or remodeled or whatnot. At the same time, there was a view that they're under the guise of maintaining or under the purpose of maintaining a low mill rate, projects were deferred. And unfortunately, they're not always cut, but they are deferred, which just simply means, as you know, things are being pushed into the future, which means other projects then have to be reprioritized. And that has a ripple impact over the years. And there also was a view that the maintenance should be looked at, because that if you look at the evidence of, be it mold, be it roofs leaking, be it collapsing walls at Central Middle School, there is a history of buildings suffering from lack of focus and lack of maintenance, and that's something that has to be done. Or otherwise, you end up facing major capital redos where maintenance may have prevented having to spend those funds. Now, the fund, as everyone knows, the town can fund its needs. It is one of the highest rated towns in a town in Connecticut with a AAA rating, which is the best you can get. It has a very large grand list, and it has a history of limiting their borrowing. So it has access to the capital markets if it does wish to do so, obviously with costs. And again, that is always the balancing act of the capital spend, the operating spend, and the tax rates that everyone wants to pay. And everybody would rather pay low taxes. But at the same time, everybody wants to see the town maintain and the quality of life that it's been known for throughout its history. There are more limitations through policy than actually the availability of capital. And Steve Munger will talk about this later. But we've repaid debt in 5 years, and we're the only town that basically does this short duration. So if you can imagine buying your house and doing a 5-year mortgage when a 30-year mortgage could be applicable, that's in essence the philosophy this town has followed for many years. Under, again, the right idea of do not get yourself overextended, do not over leverage yourself, make sure you can almost pay as you go, but that comes at a price, especially when it comes to long-term assets. So the philosophy to keep tax rates low does cause a deferral of capital projects, and that simply is a give and take of the process that we go through. So if we could turn to the next page, please. So these are some of the key observations that we will go through. I want to run through them just to provide a context and a background and a sense of direction of where we're going to. And we'll then do a deeper dive into each specific section. I do want to apologize. I should have said this at the beginning. Unfortunately, I have a conflict around 6 o'clock, so I'm going to go through my section. Unfortunately, we'll have dropped off, but my fellow committee members are more than capable of answering questions, probably much better than I would do so myself. So starting with the key observations, the capital projects are challenged in multiple ways. One of them is obviously it's a decentralized town government with overlapping powers, which really what this means is there are multiple layers in this government, which has served us very, very well. But you do have the elected, the Board of First Selectmen or Board of Selectmen's process. You have the BET process and the Board of Education process. Then you have the RTM with the RTM subcommittees. So there are multiple steps, multiple layers of approval and review throughout the budget process, which in one town official who was very involved with finance said, it may be ugly, but it works. Others say that it's very cumbersome, it lacks transparency and could be streamlined, which is a point we'll take up a little bit later. The other point that was raised was there's no formal strategic plan or vision. Now, there's often talk of a plan of conservation and development, but the purpose of that plan, as we know, is not to really have a strategic plan. It really does talk about conservation of the green areas in town and how we're developing the town overall, but it does not get into the specifics of what do we want this town to look like? How are we going to get there? What are the qualities we want to maintain and achieve? What are the new opportunities? And I think of one, prime example is First Selectman Camillo's idea of rebuilding the waterfront, which sounds very exciting and very, very attractive, but obviously would have implications for the capital, either the tax rate of the town and the capital spend, or would squeeze out other needs. So how do we balance that? And how do we get to a vision of what we want to look like in 10 years? What's the strategy to get there in 10 years? And then you get back into the tactics of how do you do your year-over-year funding. At this point, while there is 15-year planning done, and if you look at the capital budget, it's over 200 pages, so there's a lot of information that's out there. It still felt that it's not pulled together in a way to achieve a final vision of what the town of Greenwich should look like. The third point at the beginning about the decisions being made in private by a BET majority party, this is according to town charter. So this is not a Republican or Democrat issue. This is simply the way the town charter works, that the chairman of the BET, which is the ruling party, does have the extra vote in term at times of a 6-6 tie. So he or she had the final say in what the budget would look like and what the capital budget specifically will look like. The RTM later on will approve that, but they have the ability to remove items but not add items. So there is a lot of power. And again, this is according to the charter of the town. So this is not anything nefarious, but it is something very few people understand. Second point about financial models we'll get to is that there is no consistent financial model. So it makes the ability to compare projects on both the funding and benefit side inconsistent. The process for proposing and selecting capital projects, this is a point of transparency. There is no doubt that there is a huge amount of documentation that's available and pulled together. And one thing I do want to point out is the amount of work and effort that is done by department heads, department members throughout the town, elected officials, RTM members, volunteers, and pulling all this information together is absolutely astonishing. The amount of time that is spent reviewing the budget over, with various committees is significant and often done at night and, cutting into people's private time. But that doesn't mean there's transparency. That doesn't mean people truly understand how do we get to the end point. And I think this comes back to this view of what's the strategy, what's the vision, and how do all these pieces fit together. Project oversight we'll talk about is really the fact that the Board of Ed projects are mandated to have an RTM appointed committee oversee all their building projects. Well, that doesn't occur for other projects within the town. The debt limit policy we spoke about before, that the combination of changing debt limit policies, the capital levy, borrowing maturities, all of these could impact the speed and breadth of the programs that are undertaken. And lastly, anybody who has been involved in this is a 10-month process that involves, as I said, multiple meetings on multiple levels with multiple people to review similar information over and over again. Other towns such as Westport, Fairfield, who are similar in size or similar in approach, usually can do it in 2-3 months. So we have various recommendations on how to both increase the transparency for the public, but at the same time, maybe make the process more efficient and have people focus less on pulling together the budget and maybe more time spent on executing the budget. So if we could turn to the next page, please. So there are 7 opportunities to improve the creating a more strategic vision. We can just flip through these very quickly. Building a financial plan, standardizing the town's capital and financial budgeting model, enhancing the process for capital planning and setting priorities, manage and assess the implementation of town capital project thoroughly and transparency, that's the oversight, and the reducing the budget cycle. So we all go into more and create a funding plan. Sorry, I've left off Steve Munger, the most important part. A funding plan for heightened capital needs. So if we can, what we'll do is we'll do a deeper dive into each of these, which I'm sure will spur on questions, which we'll answer after the presentation. So if we can get to the next page, please. This is the creating the more strategic vision for the town. And this is, again, there have been various studies done over the years, but one gets the sense that they aren't used as a living, breathing document that's tied directly together with the long-term capital funding needs and plans, as well as the year-to-year budget. We heard repeatedly that while people are looking to plan out over many years, at the end of the day, the power of the annual budget process is such that everybody inevitably gets sucked back into a one-year view rather than where are we trying to get to over multiple years. Again, opportunities are out there for significant changes to Greenwich, which may be positive. I'll take the, I'm a proponent of the waterfront redevelopment, at least in concept. But as an example, how would that work? What's the end vision? What would be the impact? Is there consensus in the town that it is something that should be undertaken? So our focus is really 2 steps. One is the creating the vision. And again, the first selectman, we feel should convene meetings of, senior people across the department, across the board and RTM, and others who would be of interest to try to create a true vision of the town and its true strategy of how to get there. Vision without a strategy is interesting, but doesn't mean it's going to be something that can be done. A strategy without a sense of vision obviously is, inadequate in terms of we don't know where we're going, but we're making a plan to get there, so to speak. We feel this should be a very open and documented discussion, that these are not, backroom type discussion, closed door type discussions, but should be open and transparent so that the residents of Greenwich have a sense of what is being done and why it's happening. Obviously publicly informed, and then be updated periodically. And I think this is the contrast with some of the prior plans, where a lot of work has been done in prior plans. They've been, very robust and very open, but one gets the sense that after a few years, they get kind of put on the shelf and not tied back in. The point here would be, we all know that any long-term plan is subject to change, be it because of unforeseen circumstances, be it flooding or, building issues or whatnot, or changes in needs. The town's taste may change over time. All these things will impact. So this is not meant to be written in stone in terms of the specific projects underneath, but one should have a sense of where the town is driving to, how it's trying to get there. What's the importance of the school? How do you measure the importance of a recreational facility versus a sewer work? How do you look at something de novo development such as the waterfront versus simply rebuilding, schools and neighborhoods around the town? These are the type of questions that are not easy to answer because there's obviously multiple views, but we feel it's important that it be done, and the first selectman is the right person to drive that. And the second point was this tone of cooperation. Unfortunately, as we all know, a lot of these discussions do get politicized, and that's not the intent here. The point is to have transparency, to have open dialogue, to comply with FOIA. So when presentations are made, they are, subject to review ahead of time and public perusal, and that's things that are just brought in at the last minute. So, the standard of proper behavior and proper transparency are important in developing the strategic view. Not sure if anybody from my committee had anything else to add on this one. Okay.
Good, Mike, thank you. We spent a lot of time as a committee saying, if you don't know where you might want to be trying to go, it would be hard to get there. And if you were just we were concerned, as were really a large number of the people whom we interviewed, that without any kind of a vision, stuff just happens and day-to-day stuff goes on and goes on. And that was why we have made this suggestion, which we think rightly the first selectman could play an important role in helping get this going.
If I can build on your comment, Steve, I used to ask this when I was running a company that, if you're spending $1.25 billion in 15 years, do you look back and say, boy, we got done what we really wanted to get done and the town has improved because of it? Or did we just do a bunch of stuff that was important and maybe needed to do, but did not achieve that vision? And I think that's the point of tying together the strategic vision with the capital planning as well as the year-to-year budget. So there is continuity from the macro view down to the micro view.
Great, good. Well, Kate, if you'd like to do number 2, and we will let Mike go off to his conflict. And Mike, thank you for taking the time to appreciate it very much. We'll be back at you as you would expect, but thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody. Sorry to leave.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Steve. So to build on what Mike has already said now, you need a vision, but once you have that, you need a plan to achieve the vision, right? And we need to build a financial plan to support the strategic vision that we design as a town. Unfortunately, it appeared from the number of interviews that there wasn't one cohesive vision that exists. We may have a master plan for the schools, we may have a master plan for parks, we may have this and that study that's been done over a number of years, but like one cohesive direction with a financial plan to support it was not something that we found through the interviews. There was a lot of talk about the plan of conservation and development and how that might fill the gap. Ultimately, the committee determined that it was too general for really detailed planning. It didn't talk about the financial. I mean, there were discussions about open space, discussion about, you know, what the town had and might like to conserve. But in terms of translating that into an actual financial plan, that was not really the purview or the focus that occurred. And the plan of conservation and development happens once every 10 years by state statute. The 15-year capital improvement plan. When we open our budget books, we see you know, a projection out. As long as I have been a member on the RTM, we are planning to buy ourselves a ferry. To date, it has never happened. It just continues to push out and out and out. Often we would find it sounded like that we would see that again, as Mike had said, you become hyper-focused on the annual budget discussion because there's really just so much there, and there's nothing like the present. So there was this hyper-focus on, you know, the annual budget review, and in that the following 14 years were kind of set to, well, I guess we'll talk about that next year, or we'll push that out to next year. And then there's the financial funding flexibility, which is reduced by current borrowing policies. And that's where you start to see, or we started to see the trade-off, as Mike was talking about, between something like a civic center or a skating rink or a new school. And that the flexibility to take on, you know, multiple large capital projects all at the same time was really restricted by the financial funding and current borrowing. And then there's no agreed list of items to include in a plan or consistent expectations for detail. So again, different departments with different specialties would bring different emphasis to their presentations. So you'd see something different from the Department of Public Works, you know, building roads and bridges, as you might see from the Department of Park and Rec, or you might see from the Department of Education. Some of the improvement suggestions are to keep the POCD current, that 10 years go by. POCD that was developed obviously before kind of a critical point, the one in everybody's minds right now would be such as the pandemic. You know, things may have changed in some kind of, you know, when you've had a major event, or when you've had, you know, maybe something like a, you know, Superstorm Sandy, you know, you may start to see a change in what your plan of conservation and development and what the community is reacting to and hoping for in their plans of conservation and development. Second, we need to build a more detailed financial plan and focus on more than a one-year budget, including all relevant factors. So again, emphasis on, once there's a vision in place, how are we going to build a plan to get there?
Comments from other committee members? Great. Okay, Kate, thank you. Steve Munger, do you want to talk about the capital and financial budgeting model briefly?
As soon as I unmute, there we go. And
okay.
Becky, I saw you had your hand up for a second. Is there something you'd like to add?
Just really quickly, both what Mike and Kate said. So the town capital plan is 1.25 billion, but that does not include the Board of Education, which also did a plan in 2017, the master plan. That's another 750 million. So when we're talking about what do we really need as a town, if everybody got what they wanted, it's more like $2 billion. So when we're thinking about a vision and a financial plan, it has to include the town needs and the Board of Education.
Yeah, great. Very important. Thank you, Beck. Steve?
Okay, so thanks everybody for joining this call. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because only people like me get really excited about financial models. Most people, maybe their eyes glaze over a little bit. But I think the important thing to understand is it's really consistent with the prior page that Kate went through, is we don't have a standard or sort of centralized, agreed upon way of looking at the future of the town in a financial perspective. And so what that really means is we don't have a common language for comparing and thinking about alternatives. And this is no one's fault. It's really quite understandable in terms of kind of the organic growth and process of the town. But where we are right now is we have difficulty agreeing what the future is going to look like based on actions we take today, within the absence of a consistent central model for the town. So we think this is an important, little dweeby, but basically important thing for the town to think about. And I might just add before we move on that there's no naivete on the part of the committee that the idea of having a vision, the idea of having a long-term plan, the idea of having a centralized model is easy. In fact, it's quite difficult, because all the issues that get argued about in a given year's budgeting process may be even more complex as you talk about a long-term plan, because you're really pulling forward considerations of what we want to do, not just this year, but next year, the year after that, the year after that. But that actually is kind of the point. And I'm going to get into that a little bit in the funding section. But in the absence of that hard work, we really potentially miss the opportunity to make the town as good as it possibly can be. But again, we're not naive about the degree of difficulty of bringing the vision together. Any comments?
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Kate, do you want to talk about the process of capital planning and setting priorities, or would you like me to do that?
Oh, I can pick up the ball there. I'll start it
Okay,
off,
great.
and why don't you, I'll kick us off and you can wrap us up there a little bit.
Okay.
So I think we touched on it a little bit. The BET chair has a deciding vote for priorities, including individual projects in a 6-6 split. The chairman has a tie-breaking vote. That's the Board of Estimates and Taxation. The criteria for priority decisions are inconsistent. As I kind of mentioned in my previous slide, the kind of materials you might see coming out of each department could vary dramatically. Even though they have kind of a sheet that they hand in and they check a box, sometimes you'll see that sheet recycled year over year or not completely updated. This is, again, not pointing fingers. It's because of the size and scale of the budgets that the departments are putting together, and they need to be efficient about it. And they know that the Board of Estimate and Taxation members and the RTM members are going to really dial in on their proposals. So something that we saw a lot in the interviews that was commented on was that there were multiple committees or boards, entities in town government that you would have to go do somewhat of like a roadshow to each committee time and time and time again, and that was extremely an inefficient way. But that if you did not do that, you could possibly put your project in jeopardy. So it's taking a lot of time up from staff members and advocates for projects to attend numerous meetings, all times of day, often at night, to put forward initiatives that are good for the town. Steve, you want to talk a little bit about what we thought we could do to or the suggestions from the committee about improvements?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. We thought it would be good to regularly have a list of prospective capital projects that ought to be updated because the world changes. That it was not going to be that difficult to create criteria on which we could evaluate, and that this would allow, if you could have common criteria that or questions people had to answer, that would then allow comparison of projects by the people who are going to be ultimately making those decisions. and while Steve Munger laughs that only somebody like him will groove on a financial model, different parts of the town do or don't include inflation, for example, in their estimates. So that's something that could be fixed. We then think that having a forum to discuss projects transparently and compare them would help a lot. And we did hear repeatedly from lots of people that having to do the tour that Kate described of duplicative meetings and answer the same questions again and again was not respectful of the people's time who are doing the presentation. And the attendance at meetings via video conference, in addition to in-person, could be would be value add in terms of time. There are some of our departments that or bodies that simply say you must comment, otherwise you can't comment. That doesn't have to happen. So we thought that there were a variety of process improvements that could help make the comparison easier, and in turn would not push the final prioritization decision on the BET, which is where de facto it becomes now, in part because of the process that we have. So other comments from the committee, I'd be happy to hear. And otherwise, Kate, I think I would like you to talk about the implementation of projects, because we found a lot of collective desire to improve that.
Sounds great. Are we going to go to the next?
Yeah, go ahead to 5, Kate.
Yep, there we go. So we found that the projects were monitored inconsistently and not always thoroughly. This is a function, again, the committee looked at, the Board of Education and town government, and we understand that the town is one big umbrella. We have different departments and different entities. And seems like at this point from the interviews that we've really find that the way the projects are being monitored is definitely inconsistent. And then some have regulations put upon them either by state entity or by local town government. Some have things like building committees that are assigned to them, again, by either state statute or town government. Others absolutely do not. It's not a function of dollars necessarily or a project type. And then the second situation that we found that we thought could be improved upon or should be improved upon was the post-project review on lessons learned. When things go well, we want to know what was part of making a project run well so that it was delivered on time and on budget to our community. And we want to be able to repeat those successes by understanding what components were set in place to allow us to achieve them. So some of the improvements that we touched on before are a standard capital request form, building committee equivalents for major projects, not just for projects of the Board of Education. So this could apply to things like skating rinks or civic centers, which often have a little bit of a planning committee put together, sometimes in the concepts, but don't have it during the same kind of formality that you have when a building committee is set by the state statute for the Board of Education. For building committees that are done through the schools, you would see them go through a number of interviews with the selectman's office, the selectman's nominating committee, and the RTM. For building advisory groups, that kind of vetting doesn't always necessarily occur. And that's just one example of how things are formed very differently. And then monitoring costs as a project progresses. Not just having a project come back and say, oh, we need more money now, and have everyone say, well, why? Having a transparency around how costs are calculated, but also how they're expended. and setting project milestones, having a good understanding of how a project is going to, move through the feasibility to completion. And ultimately a deliverable to our community for occupancy. Again, the review of major projects after completion. We see a lot of pre-surveys about what we might want, but do we have equivalency of these, post-evaluation surveys? Did the project achieve the goals that it was set out to do? Did the project achieve something better and unexpected? Or is the project, not performing to what we want it to be? Again, we can't do project, we can't build better, do better work for our town if we don't have any data-based evidence to make these decisions around. So, and then specifying who is conducting these reviews. So, through what lens are we reviewing the projects? Are we reviewing the projects because they were fulfilling, as I just mentioned, community needs and goals? Are they fulfilling, if I can say like the warm fuzzy stuff? Are we feeling happy about the project, and is the community feeling, an enhanced sense of pride around it? Are we defining that as success? Or are we defining our successes as the project came in, $1 million under budget? How are we defining it? And who's looking through that definition, who's looking through the lens is going to define how we're seeing the success. It might not be one or the other, maybe a balance of the two.
Other comments from the committee? Okay, Kate, why don't I take the budget cycle time, and then we'll turn it over to Steve Munger. Thank you. Thank you, though. Budget cycle time was very interesting. Several of us, I happened to be one, but Becky and Barbara and others were involved in conversations with senior officers in other towns. And we just came away with a sense that our system, as was outlined earlier, takes longer than other people who are AAA rated and who maybe have less complicated towns than we in some ways, but may not have the debt capacity or whatnot. So we found complaints from really all the participants about duplicative meetings. And we found complaints again, as we had mentioned earlier, about desiring to allow attendance by video now that that technology has gotten better, as opposed to having it be in person. And again, specifying in advance what had to be in a presentation so you didn't have incomplete ones. Those were just simple fixes that we think the town would do well to improve on. And it was not going to be that hard to do it, but it would require a willingness to consider change. Other comments from the committee? And if not, I will turn it over to Steve Munger to talk about how on earth do you fund these heightened capital needs. Steve did a terrific job of coordinating a lot of discussion with a lot of people, both inside of and outside of Greenwich. So Steve, maybe over to you.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So I think as many people are aware, Greenwich actually, has had a conservative history of borrowing post the insolvency of the town in the Depression. So I think that lingering memory actually kept the town debt-free until the early 90s, at which time a policy was adopted to begin to enter the debt markets. And modest use of our debt capacity and the town's large grand list means that the town does have very significant financial capacity. One that is not constrained by broad regulatory measures or by the market. It's bound by our policy and by our willingness to pay taxes. So, and why do we even borrow at all? Because the town is in a position where it, at least in theory, can operate debt-free. I think it's to give us some modest additional financing capacity over the last several decades, and also to be a shock absorber, if you will, to deal with year-to-year fluctuations in capital needs relative to the capital levy. So the capital levy is the portion of property taxes that go to our capital budget. In the difference between our capital budget and the capital levy vary year by year, and that's the amount we borrow. So to bring this back to a higher level, funding is a tool. Plan comes before the tool. So the most critical thing to keep in mind is that the right funding plan for the town is has to be driven by what the town's plans are, and it's best created if we have a vision of what those plans are over a forecasted period of time, not just individual, year by year. And that leads to the title of this page, create a funding plan for heightened capital needs. Because everyone on this call is aware that there are potential demands on the town's capital budget that are significantly higher than they have been in recent years. I'm not going to project a view one way or the other as to how that should sort out, but there is certainly the potential for heightened capital spending requirements in the next 5 to 10 years. And if we are to create a funding plan for that heightened capital need, it really involves turning 3 very important dials to help us do that. One dial is examining those debt limit policies and where we need to give ourselves flex, or do we need to give ourselves flex. The second is how much do we want to pay in current year by year taxes, and how much do we want to adjust the capital levy to take into account the fact that we have these heightened capital needs. And the third is to examine extending the debt maturity of the money that we borrow, which is a trade-off. Extending the maturity of our borrowings allow us to pay debt back over a longer period of time. And as we all know, or most of us know from having mortgages, that it lowers your monthly payment if you can spread it out. On the other hand, you increase your interest charges over time, and that kind of increases the overall outlay that the town incurs to do a project. So that's a trade-off. And the other trade-off is that by extending the payback of the funding of a project today over a longer period of time, we burden our capital budgets in the future with the need to pay that debt back. So it's a trade-off, but it's one that could be particularly valuable in the context of heightened capital needs. Many towns, well, as Mike pointed out, actually all the towns in Connecticut that we would consider comparable do in fact fund with a longer term than we do, 20 years being probably the benchmark. And there is some logic to that when we look at long-lived assets. If we look at a school, if we look at town infrastructure of a long life nature, there is, I think, a very valid argument that paying down the capital put forward for that over, say, a 20-year period lays the obligation to pay that over an evolving town population that's enjoying those assets. So people whose kids are in school, in the high school today, are not going to be the people who have kids in high school 10 years from now, and shouldn't those people 10 years from now be paying for something that was done at the high school? So that's valid logic, particularly for long-lived assets and the notion of spreading it over those who are using those assets over time. But again, the most important point is that the tool follows the plan, the funding follows a vision and a plan for how we want to conduct capital spending in this town over a longer period of time. And it has to be a plan that accommodates a heightened capital need if we, in fact, move in that direction. I'll pause there.
Other comments from the committee? I would simply add that Steve has synthesized a lot of discussion, and we know that of things that are controversial, even what's on this page may be more controversial to some of the league members or to others in the town than some of the other observations. And we are not, the committee is not saying that we know the answer, but we think that we are saying that this is a topic that ought to be looked at thoroughly by the relevant bodies. And the best context to do it is in the context of a vision and a broader financial plan. That's not a shot at the BET or anybody else. It's simply saying that with the needs at the level which we're seeing them now, and they've accumulated over a long bit of time, that for the town to get remotely close to meeting the aggregate needs, we need to think broadly about how do we finance it. Any other committee member comments? And if not, I'll move on. Okay, let's go on to the next page, please. The committee was asked by the league, well, what does this mean we, the league, should do? And because they didn't want to have a study just to have a study and stick it on a shelf, at least we hope. Those of you who have been involved with the league historically for a long period of time know that the league has asked for process improvements before. We've listed some of the times that this has been done. We may not have an inclusive list, but you can see this is not a new topic for the league. And you've talked about charter change, BET changes, and RTM changes. And candidly, there have been mixed results. A lot of work was done on RTM reform. A lot of people went in and met with the RTM, and I think one prospective change out of 20 was adopted. So there's been mixed results on that. So we've asked ourselves, what are the things that the league could have input on? Now, we thought identifying which potential improvements in the whole project all the way along on all that we've said are most important from the league's perspective, and that focusing on those is probably better than focusing on everything. We thought that the league clearly could stimulate and inform and then stimulate involvement by the public at large, that encouraging transparency and accountability in town government was something we thought the league could get behind. The league, if it wanted to, could be in, if for example, the first selectman were to be asked to assist on creating a town vision, the league could help in that. The league could push for reconsideration of town borrowing policies. That's not to say they ought to be X or Y, but that looking at what we can do better or differently ought to be done. So those were areas where we thought the league itself could take a stand if that's what you chose. And that was the basis for our thinking about a draft of a concurrent statement. We have put that up. This is not a final draft. And Sandy, if you'd like to go through that, I'm happy to let you do that, or I'm happy to go through it. And after that, we could have questions, whichever way you'd like to do things.
Are you talking about the concurrence?
Yeah.
Okay, no, I'll take care of that at the end. I think what we
Okay.
want to do is, are you is this the end of your, I think it's the end.
This is the end of our formal remarks, and
Okay.
we're very happy to talk about questions. Several of you have been nice and submitted questions already. There was a very thoughtful one from a former BET member with whom we can and should have a continued dialogue about it.
I've taken the notes of a couple of questions that have appeared in the chat. And while that happens, why don't, if someone in the audience has a question that they wish to raise their hand for, you can do so by just going to the bottom of your screen, and you'll see a reactions button. And if you click that, you can raise your hand. I'll know you want to ask a question. So I'm going to take a couple of them that came in through the chat. Okay. What do you think are the one or two things that could be done next week or next month that could improve the process per our recommendation, your recommendations, and who or what could make it happen?
Anybody on the committee want to take a first shot?
I'll take a very tiny toe in the water on it.
Go for it.
So something that I think could be done as we're approaching the next budget cycle is looking at where we could combine meetings for departments. So whether a department gives a presentation or a joint presentation, but with intent. Right now, RTM, when chairs cooperate and dialogue with each other, sometimes you'll see the education committee and the law department will team up for a joint presentation, and then they'll go off to their separate corners and the committees will discuss and vote. But that doesn't happen by intent. That happens really only at the initiation of the chairs kind of talking to one another and recognizing that it's a big topic, and to have a department come once and come again to both would detract. So I think that's something that could be suggested really quickly, is finding a way to have a joint presentation or joint meeting for departments, whether it's the RTM, the BET, or the Selectman's office.
Sandy, another thing that I think we could consider would once the league membership is voted, I think it would be good to debrief relevant people on some of the major town boards and bodies of what we're doing, whether that's the Selectman office or the BET or the Board of Ed, because there are things that everyone could do if they were of a mind. Right now, the contents of this presentation are known primarily to really league members and the members of the committee, i.e. the committee is aware of it, but a lot of very important people in the town are not. And then Barbara, I see your hand is raised, so maybe you ought to, you feel free to chime in. And Barbara's been the co-chair and labored hard on this, so but she said, I'll let you guys do some of the initial talking.
I think something very simple that could be done is to have, and Catherine touched on it, have a systematic form that when you're presenting your project to the selectmen to even get on the possibility of being funded, that everybody should be presenting the same information. And that information should be gathered not just among your own department, but they should be talking to the community. You have a DPW project that goes out and they think it's a great project, and it might be, but maybe the people in that neighborhood don't think it's such a great project. And we've seen that happen. So I think we need to have that input from the community early on so that we don't waste a lot of time discussing a project that eventually is going to get voted down, and we've wasted time and money in all that planning. So just a systematized form of presenting to the selectmen, and then that form also then goes to the BET, because remember, those departments have to present to the BET to get their money. And lots of times there's information missing and people have to come back, and it takes up BET time and it takes up a lot of people's time. So just simple systematized forms.
Great, thanks,
Okay.
Barbara.
Becky has her hand up.
So I just want to say that we're not reinventing the wheel. Other towns we interviewed, like Westport, do their budget process in 4 months. And we talked to the head of the Board of Finance there, and besides being able to do it in 4 months because they don't duplicate meetings, he said to us, importantly, it's not just about the process. It's the people involved in the process and how they make decisions that are best for the town. So you can have the best process, but if you don't have people willing to work together, the process isn't going to work. But we're not reinventing the wheel because other towns do it.
Great, thank you.
Okay, great. Are any other comments on that question? Okay. Another one that I started, the financial metrics and template for the multi-year plan have been developed and have been used by members of the BET and RTM, but need to be institutionalized, i.e. incorporated into practice. That's from David Weisbrod. Anybody want to comment on that? Maybe I'll let
Uh,
David. David, is David out there somewhere? Raise your hand, David. Maybe you want to explain that. There? He's just got his name on the screen. He's
He sent
Twitter or
a
something.
question in and disappeared.
I'm-
No,
I'm-
Speak up, David. I think it would be good for you to do so.
No. There is a template that's been drafted and is used by many members of the BET as well as members of the RTM. It's very complicated, as I think Steve Munger pointed out, but a lot of work has been done. And it just needs to be and it's frankly also used by the budget director in the town. So it's been drafted, it's out there. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And it needs to have an imprimatur that says, okay, this is how we will evaluate multi-year capital requests.
David, who do you think is in the position to give that imprimatur to it?
Probably the BET. It should I mean, my guess is that we would want to take it formally to the BET and say, you know, we have a debt policy subgroup of the BET, and one of the, I think it has to meet every couple of years. And so the next time, or even without that committee, it could be presented to the BET as the financial model to be relied upon.
Well, I think if it'd be helpful to the BET, and I know I'm speaking to someone who's somewhat familiar with the BET, we'd be very happy to be supportive of that kind of a thing if you thought that made sense.
Becky,
yeah.
So I want to say, David, you're right on, because again, we talked to other towns, not that best practices are the best thing, but Fairfield says the town has a model that the Board of Finance, which is their BET, agrees to and supports. They get advice, though, from an outside bond expert on debt capacity and interest rate forecasts. They don't want to exceed their 10% debt service limit. Inflation assessments and assumptions are included, and an escalator clause to anticipate increases in projects that they've approved. So I agree with you. That's the way to go, but we have to do it.
Right.
Okay. Are there
Sandy, go
other,
ahead.
go ahead. And other questions coming from the audience? I have, let's see, I have one more. Oh, don't you think setting up building committees for all capital projects is unwieldy? It's bad enough. Sorry, it's bad enough for school building committees alone, but I mean, when you're doing it for every town project.
Let me take a first cut at that and then invite the committee members to talk too. We candidly felt that we were not so much worried about the school projects. We were worried about large projects away from the school so that don't always have oversight. And we felt there ought to be some kind of oversight, and that there was just plain not a consistent oversight process in the town. And we felt that was leading to incomplete analysis to do the projects, incomplete supervision of the projects, not learning lessons from what we did or didn't do right. And so the town would have to define a threshold, but we think the key thing was oversight, and we felt that the oversight, there's not an oversight body in the town that's operating effectively now in the committee's view.
Right.
Can that be done professionally as opposed to being by a committee? I mean,
We
professional.
had discussed that possibility. We had discussed that, it said buildings committees, but I think Hillary, who's on the call here, we took a lot of time to discuss the value of owner project manager representative, whether that is a consultant role with a fee. So Dorothy Hamill, I believe, or not Dorothy Hamill, sorry, Eastern Greenwich Civic Center has, I believe, had requested funding for an additional owner's project manager, owner's representative. They had done that at New Lebanon as well, and found that it was very successful at New Lebanon, which in theory led to what they're doing at Eastern Greenwich Civic Center, although I can't confirm that. So not necessarily an engaged group of volunteers, But Hillary and I also talked about the value of having a paid consultant or, paid staff by the town that has a level of accountability, because that was something else also discussed when we talked about this oversight and management. Volunteers, the capacity, talent, and depth, of the people on this call, of volunteers in town that I interact with regularly is, far beyond, it's an amazing group of people everywhere I go in Greenwich. The talent is so deep and so rich. But at the same time, how much accountability can you ask from a volunteer effort? So I think that's a very valid question, Sandy.
Okay, Becky, you're
One more comment. So this is a really interesting, it's personal to me. The largest capital project right now in Greenwich, other than maybe the hospitals, is the Bruce Museum. It's $65 million. And it's all been raised by private funding. There is no committee of the town, and the town owns the Bruce Museum, but there's no capital committee. So, but we have our own internal committee, to be sure. So I think that's a very interesting question. And maybe you have to look at it project by project and decide the dollar amount, who's funding it, how much, is it grant money? Is it private donations? But everybody passes off the Bruce, $65 million. There is no town committee, and it's a town asset.
okay. Barbara, you had your hand up too.
Right. Building committees are now 4 Board of Ed building committees, and to get the proper people on those committees who have the time, and it's a huge time commitment, is very difficult. But I agree with the other speakers that there needs to be some reporting. There needs to be some transparency. We never know whether town buildings overrun their budgets. There's no reporting back. Whereas a school building committee, besides having a committee, we have to report quarterly to the RTM. So that's a big miss in town, is that there's no oversight. So we have no idea whether buildings, come within budget or whatever. So that's really key and easily done.
Okay. Hillary, you have your hand up. Hillary? Hillary? Does anyone else have a question or a question to raise? She's there, I know, she's got to be there.
Sorry,
just
I
unmuted.
couldn't unmute myself. To speak to Catherine's point, a part of the owner's rep responsibility is knowing what the town needs at all times and what their expectations are of the project. It takes away the liability of the town to some extent because they've relayed what they need. And with an owner's rep, they also are in charge of managing each individual contractor. So it puts less liability or strain on individuals specifically within the town and, those who are surrounding the project, and puts it more onto a middleman per se.
Hillary, thank you. And I should thank Hillary too, because even though she's moved out of town, she's stayed involved in making sure we know what we're doing. So thank you, Hillary.
You're welcome.
She's providing accountability to you guys.
That's it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And again, I think the tone of what you're hearing from the committee is that there are just little things we can do to make it better. And we were looking for things that didn't have to be, earth-shatteringly confrontational that we can do. There are some tough decisions about tax policy and borrowing. We understand that. And what we're saying, I think, is that if we can create more of a common framework and plan, those decisions can become more rational and less political, which in the world that we're, I guess, all currently living in might not be a bad thing.
Can I ask a question about the implications for a taxpayer when there've got to be financial implications for, paying for everything as you go when interest rates are low. don't your taxes actually, I don't know if you looked at that, but what happens? Aren't you actually paying more taxes than you need to? If you don't borrow when the interest rate is very low? I mean, we don't have that situation right now, but we did. And I'm wondering what you know about that.
Yeah,
Steve,
so from a
Yeah,
financial point of view, it gets a little arcane, I think, Sandy, but basically, if you think about a dollar and whether the dollar is in the town's pocket or whether the dollar is in the taxpayer's pocket, in a low interest rate environment, yep, the town's paying lower interest. And the dollar is sitting, if the town borrows, the town is paying a low level of interest and the dollar is sitting in the taxpayer's pocket and the taxpayer is earning a low level of interest on it. If it's a high interest rate environment, the town is paying a lot of interest where the taxpayer could be making a lot of interest. It's so it gets a little complicated when you try to look at it in terms of that particular trade-off. I think the way most people would think about it is, what are the town's outlays that the taxpayers have to pay for? And there is a lot of academic work as to whether municipalities and government entities below the federal level should try to be market timers with respect to interest rates. And generally the academic work says no, because most of Wall Street can't really accurately predict things year to year. You could have said the interest rate environment in 2019 is really low, so we should borrow the bejesus out of things. And then you had 2020 when interest rates went to zero. So, and of course today you look back on and say, well, wow, the town could have borrowed a lot of money in 2021 and enjoyed low interest rates for the next 20 years, but hindsight is powerful. But again, the academic work says it's probably not smart to try to be a market timer. And I think the bigger issue is the repayment of the debt. And does it make sense to have a repayment schedule, one that spreads out over 20 years and affects taxpayers 20 years from now, as opposed to one that's over 5 years and affects taxpayers just for the next 5 years? It's a great question, but it's one of those kind of, you can stare at it for a long time and not necessarily get to a satisfying answer.
Okay.
Yeah, I think what Steve did say though in his part, and Mike Bodson to start off, is the needs are very large that the town at least has put on its wish list. And we don't see, absent looking again at the financial policies, we don't see a way to meet those needs under the current process. And so that ultimately becomes a voter question. And I know the League of Women Voters is interested in having people vote. But at the end of the day, some of the ultimate answers to some of these become politically related questions for the voters to decide on. So our focus was, let's try to frame those issues, work on the process improvements we can, so that people can, make the hard decisions like the question you just asked, Cindy.
Okay, Jonathan Weiner.
Oh, you're on mute, Jonathan.
Can you unmute?
Yeah,
Jonathan?
I know. I got it.
It wouldn't be a Zoom call.
I'm a
if you
little-
didn't do that at least once.
Oh, well, it's because you're in Jamaica, Jonathan.
Well, things are a little slower down here. That is true. So, the only point I wanted to make is that the use of debt really helps with the lumpiness of capital needs. So, if capital needs were consistent every year or relatively consistent, you can have a consistent policy about. It's much easier to have a consistent policy about how you might borrow, taxpayer increases, things of that nature. When you now start introducing larger capital needs, then what you're using debt for is to kind of solve that lumpiness that otherwise, on a 5-year repayment schedule would cause, a current set of town residents to bear a lot of that burden and much higher taxes. So I don't think, to Steve Munger's point and to you, Steve Waters, it's just a tool, I think, to help us through a period of time where we need to handle some larger projects.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it, John. Thank you.
Becky?
So I'll make one final comment. So I agree, it's revenues, debt, or taxes. So even though traditionally we've been against debt, our current mill rate is 11.28. Westport's is 18. But Steve did this calculation for us in the report. If we increased our tax levy $4 to $5 million a year for 4 or 5 years, and every 3.75 million is 1 mil. 1 mil, we're at 11, Westport's at 18. We could potentially be able to finance a good part of our capital needs. Maybe not a whole school, like $100 million school. But the thing is, it could be done through a mill rate of 4 to 5 million more a year for 4 to 5 years. 1 mil is 4 million. And we could have a lot of our deferred capital paid for, and it wouldn't be debt. But it is a combination of revenue, debt, and the mill rate.
Okay.
I
I
just-
have,
Mike, sorry, just to jump in. Sorry, I
Sorry.
came back.
yep,
Just 2 other points. Part of this is the item I raised about the maintenance, where as we defer some of these capital projects and you're not doing the proper maintenance level, inevitably you're going to get the unexpected, roof collapse, building collapse, mold, whatever you want to call it. And you're now rejuggling and reshuffling your payments. The other part is, if the principal amount of the project stays the same, it is just, again, it's borrowing 15 years versus 30 years on your mortgage. You will be paying a different interest rate. There will be a bit there, but you're not changing the cost of the actual project itself, other than the interest rate, which is not an inconsequential piece. But again, it's the timing of when do you want to get these things done. I think that's what was being said before, of you've got all this pent up demand. Trying to do it over a 5-year funding or do it pay as you go is just not feasible without creating a massive tax bill. But if you look at it over a 20 or 30-year period and extend your debt servicing over a period of time where you do have sinking funds, et cetera, so that you do have fiscal responsibility, does that help you, meet the needs of the town in a more effective and efficacious manner?
We're a town led by a vision, not a town chasing an interest rate. And I think that's shown by the committee deciding to put the first 2 slides up there, have a vision and have a plan. Don't try and be a fortune teller, is kind of what I hear Steve saying, Steve Munger.
another question that was in the chat was, did the committee consider the former capital improvement process that Selectman Jim Lesh created and seemed to work well during his tenure?
David Weisbrod must have submitted that question.
No, I don't think so. I think this is Joanne Messina.
Sorry to out you, Joanne. Sandy did it, not me. We did. And in fact, I was able to have, thanks to David, had dinner with Jim on his process. People liked that process, but that process was abandoned by a prior first selectman. We heard talk about that process, and some people considered it too, quote unquote, clumsy and formal, but we do see merit in the basic idea, not necessarily in the exact specificity of it, but we know that Jim was trying to move us in that direction.
Okay, are there any other questions or comments from anybody at this stage?
I think you ought to move to the what we're going to be doing. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to move to the closing statements, and just so that people are asking, they're making comments in the chat that I think you should be aware of.
Yeah.
First, I just want to say thank you to the committee for the work they've done to investigate this important issue. And thanks especially to Steve and Barbara for their leadership. Comments in the chat say this is simply a superb dialogue, just excellent. Very pleased with scope and all the hard work of committee and their recommendations and so on. So, I mean, this is really great, and I appreciate your time that you put into this. The purpose of this evening has been to understand if the membership supports the conclusions reached by the Capital Project Study Committee. There are two ways to illustrate this support in a league study: by consensus and by concurrence. And the history of the Greenwich League is to use a concurrent statement approach. A draft of a potential concurrent statement with language taken directly from the study gives us a starting point. Jess, can you put that concurrent statement up? Okay, this is a draft. It requires approval of both the committee. The committee needs to discuss it, and the board needs to consider it and discuss it. We hope to do both of those things in the next week or two. And then on the board will hopefully, the committee will pass it or develop some version of it that they support. And this is coming directly from the language of the study. So there's nothing in here that is not from the study itself. So the board is having a board meeting on the 18th, and that will be part of our discussion at our board meeting as well. Then on January 25th, we will hold another membership meeting to vote on the approved concurrent statement. We hope that you will all register to attend that meeting. We will need a quorum to approve it. Once adopted by the committee, the board, and the membership, the concurrent statement becomes a local position of the League of Women Voters of Greenwich. We will then share it with community leaders and voters in the hope of stimulating community discourse about how the decision-making process on capital matters can be made more strategic, inclusive, and transparent. If in the meantime you have questions, thoughts, or ideas about this important issue, please go to our webpage devoted to it, www.lwvgreenwich.org/capital. And if you sign in, you will be able to read everything on that page. Or you can contact me directly. Until the membership actually approves it, however, we are not sharing this information with anyone else. If the league membership doesn't approve it, it doesn't really go anywhere. So that's why the meeting on the 25th of January is really important. I hope you will register and plan to attend that meeting. Again, thank you all for coming and attending. And I hope you will stay engaged on this. This is one of the most important issues facing our community in the years to come.
Sandy, if it's okay, I would just like again to publicly thank the committee members in front of the membership, because people did a great deal of work and I really am most appreciative. And as you can see, the committee was not shy.
You don't want a shy committee, that's for sure.
Nope.
We were just trying to keep up with you, Steve.
There we go.
Yeah.
We will also have this, this evening has been recorded and will be shared with members. And we have had our secretary, Carolyn Atkins, taking minutes, so we know what has transpired in this conversation. So thank you all, and enjoy your good evening and dinner if you haven't had it already, or at least maybe a glass of wine. Thanks, everyone.
All right, bye.
Bye.